Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar hosted by Energy Consumers Australia. My name is Claire. I'm a manager in advocacy and policy at Energy Consumers Australia, and I'll be the MC for this session. So before we begin, I'll begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting today. I'm calling from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. I also extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. So for those who are joining us for the first time, Energy Consumers Australia is the national voice for household and small business energy consumers. We advocate for a fair, affordable and reliable energy system. And one of the ways we nurture new ideas and support other advocates to do this is through the Gill Owen Scholarship. The scholarship honours Dr. Gill Owen, who was an inaugural director at the ECA board and a dedicated advocate for energy consumers in Australia and the UK, and whose legacy includes shaping institutions like the AR's Consumer Challenge Panel. And since her passing in 2016, the scholarship, established in partnership with her husband, David Green, also enabled Australian researchers to travel internationally, engage with global expertise, and bring back insights to benefit consumers. Before we begin, I would like to share that the application for the next round of this scholarship is now open and will close on the 19th of October, which Beck will pop in the chat the link for the scholarship for if you want to find out more. All right, so we'll jump straight in. Our speaker today is Dr. Glen Currie, the 2025 Gill Owen Scholar. Glen is the Program Impact Manager at Climate Works Centre, which he leads efforts to scale transformation in Australia's energy system. He brings more than 20 years of experience across engineering, energy policy, and industry innovation. So through his research, Glen explored how California's energy system compares with Australia's, looking at the policy, regulatory, and social dimensions of moving away from gas and towards electrification. So today he'll share those key lessons and insights from that work, including what Australia can learn from California's experience and how we can avoid some of the pitfalls. So I'll just run quickly through the agenda. We'll go through Glen's presentation, and then we'll open up to the audience for a Q&A session, and then we'll have some closing remarks from Adam Collins. All right, so with that, I'll hand over to Dr. Glen Currie for his presentation.
Hello, I'm Glen Currie, and I'm going to be talking about the work I did in looking at the Californian system. So I'm work at Climate Works Centre, which is part of Monash University. I thank you very much for coming along to hear ideas on energy at your lunchtime. It's a good week. We've got lots of renewable energy in Australia at the moment, very high output from solar and wind at the moment. And just today there was an announcement that solar and wind generation globally is now larger than coal. So that's a milestone for the first time this year. This presentation is of insights from my funded research travel to California under the Gill Owen Scholarship, which was just introduced before. The Gill Owen Scholarship is offered through the Energy Consumers Australia. So firstly, I'll consider the contrast with California, especially the price of electricity, then look at the gas pipe shutdown policy ideas, and finally explore how doing gas pipe shutdown doesn't work without considering other enabling policies. So the flow for today is that I'll outline the lessons from California, and particularly their high electricity price, and then look at their gas policy, and finally look at enabling policies to do that in Australia. I'm presenting from the Kulin Nation, and I acknowledge and pay respects to the traditional custodians and elders, past and present, of the lands and waters of the Wurundjeri people. I also extend my respect to all traditional custodians and elders of the lands and waters where we all operate. Now, Climate Works Centre is 16 years old. We've got offices in Australia, Southeast Asia, with about 100 staff. So the work that we do is to try and bridge the gap between research and climate action. So the idea is that we're using our research and working with other people's research to take that to the world and try and drive change. One thing that we do is the scenario modelling, looking at the trajectory, the least cost trajectory towards net zero. In our latest scenarios, published about a year ago and shown here, we modelled two possible scenarios, the 1.5 degree scenario, which is shown with the orange line, and the well below 2 degree scenario in purple. So our 1.5 degree scenario shows Australia rapidly reducing emissions and achieving net zero by 2039. Our well below 2 degree scenario shows a slower pace, achieving net zero by 2050. So being the Gill Owen Scholar this year, I researched the question of comparing California's energy transition with Australia. To do that, I conducted interviews with policymakers, regulators and advocates in California. Then I made a policy and regulatory comparison to extract some policy lessons for our energy transition in Australia. We can reflect that California and Australia have similarities, wildfire risks, or we talk about it as bushfire risk. The grid size, interestingly, is similar, so similar number of kilometres of distribution grid. And we've got a similar population and per capita wealth. California, though, is known for its leadership in climate policy, and it's long held the world, or led the world, in setting emission standards for vehicles, for example. So we can reflect that difference in Australia and California, but we do have different energy architectures. There are useful contrasts also in terms of gas policy, which I'll explore. But first, I want to just look at the cost of electricity, which is significantly different in California. One advantage we have in Australia is lower wholesale electricity prices. The wholesale electricity prices is the supplier price before the costs of transport and retail are added. This graph shows Australia's wholesale electricity is about half the cost of electricity in California in summer. So we asked, well, why is this the case? This slide allows us to reflect on why Australia has got much lower median prices, both on the wholesale price but also the retail price. The retail price in California is 48 cents, the average, and in Australia just 27 cents, so nearly half what it is in California. So this slide is the wholesale prices, and so we can see there's quite a big difference in the summer. So Australia is actually half the price as California in the wholesale side. So if you go to the next slide, we can have a look at the impact of that and why that's so different. So this slide really is talking also about the retail price being different and significantly different. It's about half the price in Australia for retail. Some of the influences on that price difference is that there's wildfire effects, and they've had that very significant effect on recent fires in Los Angeles that you'd be aware of. And in their system in California, the liability does flow through, and so that the liability for those fires is being reflected in the cost of electricity. The other issue I'll talk about is regulatory complexity, and so that's the process that you have to go through to drive any change. And so the regulatory complexity is quite high in California, and I'll talk a little bit about that as well. So one of the changes that the differences is this new bill in California. So the Senate Bill 1221 is to address the electrification of gas customers. This new law means from next year, California utilities can designate up to 30 neighbourhood zones where households can switch to all electric systems and pipelines are retired. It requires gas mapping, shown in the right image here. So that's some PG&E gas mapping for heat or fire risk. It also requires annual reporting and pilot programs. Australia can learn from this, and we do have an opportunity to learn from this with the retirement of some of our gas distribution. Next slide. So in looking at in more detail at this Senate Bill 1221, which is aimed at transitioning from gas to electric infrastructure, it allows utilities where it's cost effective to shut down ageing gas pipelines and replace them with all electric heating and cooking systems. And it does actually include that process of electrification of those houses that are affected. It also requires utilities to submit detailed annual maps identifying pipeline replacement zones, disadvantaged community locations, and decarb targets. It may see backlash because it only requires 2/3 of the customers to agree, and previous efforts by PG&E have included 100% sign up by houses. So only having 2/3 of the houses is a risk. It's also sparked debate over cost recovery and whether electrification upgrades should be treated as capital assets, and this is something that's being explored by the AER in Australia as well. So the process of gas transition includes mapping and understanding costs. In this image, we see how PG&E in California has mapped the gas assets and technical feasibility of disconnection. Their geospatial tool integrates pipe conditions, customer bills, fire risk for planning, and it includes avoided costs of gas asset upgrades, the electricity system, additional costs, community processes, and the different building types. And as I mentioned before, also disadvantaged community locations. Climate Works, where I work and in my work, has been working on an electrification research in Victoria. The image on the left shows the AusNet gas service area in Victoria. We identified that some pipelines, shown in yellow, have higher justification for removal, and on the right you see a detailed view of where these pipelines are located relative to the streets in Melbourne. Australia has got a strong case for electrifying gas services. This is due to partly to our higher costs for gas in Australia relative to California, and efficient installation processes, which I'll explore a bit later. These make electrification an economic choice. It means electrified customers actually stop paying for maintaining gas pipes, but it does mean that the remaining users could see their bills soar. So we need to understand coordinated policy that I'll talk about now. Next slide. So firstly, we can avoid the lock-in of further gas assets to avoid there becoming replacement problems in the future. The Victorian government, for example, has banned new gas connections and restricted the supply of new gas appliances so that when gas appliances are at the end of their life, they're switched to electrical appliances. What we mean by demand here is managing energy use and assets to balance the electricity system for reliability and efficiency. So this is moving from gas across to electricity. But when we do transfer or turn off some gas distribution, clearly it has an impact on the electricity system. So the speed we reduce gas supply and electrify is an input into our demand side planning. We've got a huge opportunity on the demand side to reduce the cost of our energy transition and to speed it up. The recent Australian Energy and Electricity Sector Plan has 5 foci, one of which is on the demand side. It's to transform energy demand, electrify where possible, and use energy more efficiently and flexibly. These are all demand side planning issues. Next slide. Again, the electrification of gas customers will also need to leverage our integrated planning, which includes coordination between governments to ensure alignment on demand-side issues, standards, procurement. Coordination and governance also includes utilities having clarity about their cost recovery, investment timelines, and regulatory expectations to navigate the transition. Also, this may mean restructuring utility business models. For example, in California, CPUC, Future of Gas proceeding, is considering this restructuring. The CPUC is the Californian Public Utilities Commission that regulates a bit like our AER. Next slide. As mentioned earlier, the electrification of customers will leave the other customers paying the full cost of the gas pipes. Strong energy transition design can address this risk and also address the cost shifts affecting non-solar users, for example, renters, apartment dwellers, and low-income households. It's not just grand policy ideas, it includes the coordination of policy and knowledge sharing and working with local community groups. Next slide. So Australia is well positioned in this energy transition, and our strategic advantage is shown through our solar and battery booms. When policy cleared the path, households moved faster than anyone expected. This is reflected in probably 5 areas. Firstly, the strength of our supply chains. For my solar business that I had previously, I made a dozen trips to China, for example. Second, our workforce readiness with flexible trades, and there's 20,000 solar licensed electricians in Australia. Thirdly, our small business innovation. There are over 8,000 solar installation businesses in Australia, local firms creating jobs. Fourthly, policy action and certainty, and this has given people the confidence to invest. And it's all been enabled by consumer sentiment, which is driven by consumer appetite, by their consumer sentiment. Next slide. So finally, in summing up, what are the shifts we're going to need to make in Australia that we've learned from California? Would be firstly planning for a rapid and orderly phase out of gas, and that's shown in the top left of this image, using ideas like California's Law 1221 that I talked about. We can plan and map pipeline retirements and use mapping tools to identify where the retirement of gas and electrification can deliver benefit. Second, shown in the top right here, demand-side planning. Consistent data and shared methodology can build a unified view of the investment opportunities on the demand side. If we integrate demand response, energy efficiency, and all those consumer energy resources, that's all those solar and batteries and EVs into the integrated system plans, or ISPs, we can move the demand side to be on par with supply in terms of planning. We can also optimise existing network assets, the poles and wires, and support a lower cost transition to renewables. Thirdly, in the bottom left of this image, we can build our plans that consider low-income households, renters, non-solar customers, and apartments. We can use smart tariff design, support electrification, ensure these customers are not left paying high costs as others leave the gas system. And finally, in the bottom right of the image there, we can strengthen interjurisdictional coordination. And that strengthened coordination between states and territories and the Commonwealth can deliver system solutions. This is really important on the demand side planning and includes efficiency, electrification, energy management, demand response, and even load shifting. And of course, we can keep going with our solar and battery boom, it locks in momentum. Next slide. So in summary, Australia can achieve a successful energy transition. A rapid and orderly transition is not a distant challenge, it's this decade's challenge. We can plan to close gas pipelines that are no longer needed. Rooftop solar adoption and now the battery rollout shows we can move faster than expected. Thank you, and I'll take questions now, and Claire will moderate. Thanks.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Glen. That was a really interesting presentation. As Glen mentioned, we'll now take questions. So if you have any questions or comments for Glen, please just pop it into the Q&A box. While we're just waiting for that to come through, I had a question for you, Glen. During your time in California, was there anything that you learned about how they engaged or didn't engage with communities there? Was there anything that you learned from that perspective about community engagement?
Some of the PG&E gas work where they've been engaging with communities is very interesting. They've been looking at, as I mentioned before, this idea that they'd get 100% sign-on previously. So this new law, as I mentioned, is only looking at getting 2/3 of the people or houses to sign up. But what was interesting previously is they've been really looking at how do they get those customers across without obviously sending the PG&E shareholders into a spin. But a lot of it was just showing that it was cheaper to not only turn off the gas pipe and electrify, but actually putting in stoves and hot water heating in those houses, so that they were including that in their planning. So that was very interesting that they were looking at that whole transition for those houses.
Really interesting. It's kind of related, but we got a question from Hugo. He asked, in California, who's paying for asset redundancies? Do gas distribution businesses get compensated?
So the way the Californian system is, it's actually where their cost of running or upgrading the gas system is actually higher than electrification, so that it's just a straight out decision by the gas companies to shut down those gas pipes. The reason that it needs to be through statute is that there are protections under the requirement to supply, which includes the requirement to supply gas as well as electricity to those houses. So the statute assists them in that process of engaging, but basically it's an economic decision by the gas companies to shut down pipes that are uneconomic. And we've seen that in Victoria and regional Victoria fairly recently with the shutdown of regional gas pipes by one of our gas suppliers.
Thank you. We'll just keep waiting for a few more questions to come through. Actually, I had another question, Glen. I'm also just learning a lot through this presentation, so thank you so much. What do you think is one thing that Australia is doing better than California when it comes to managing the shift away from gas?
Well, the whole system is doing quite well in that we've got national planning that's occurring. So the ISP is a national plan. In California, they actually do have 30% of their energy supplied interstate, so that there's a significant amount of their power comes from interstate, but only on a price basis. There's no planning across state borders there, so that California has, through their Californian ISO, so that CAISO does its own planning within California, and then it just buys whatever the markets can supply at the times that they're short. So in Australia, on the other hand, we don't just run the planning for each state separately. We have the national plan, and that's then balanced out with the transmission and transport of energy across Australia. So in terms of gas, what we're doing well would be probably really it's California that's doing very, very well on their gas transition, which is what I've been talking about in the presentation. I'm not sure, be particularly complementary on a lot of what we're doing in Australia.
Yeah, no, that's good. So we got a question here. In relation to gas mapping, did you get insight into how all these data sets or sources, such as pipe condition, fire risk data, etc., are gathered in one central gas map? Is this part of legislation or regulations?
So that's come through on the 1221 law that came in last year, so that included that process of integrating the mapping, which of course there's privacy issues because you've got billing information that's sitting on a map that might also have fire risk data or housing type. So all of these are different, more or less private sort of data sets. And so they're in the middle of that privacy question, and they haven't yet published those maps, but the idea being that they'll integrate those maps. So in terms of learnings is to say it is very, very useful for them because they can generate a map like that one I showed in the slide set, where they can look at fire risk and think about and plan for the fire risk to their assets. But there are issues around privacy, and California and Australia both have got quite strong privacy laws. So there are challenges in that mapping process.
Someone asked, do you think it makes sense to wait until gas becomes uneconomic to take action in Australia?
So already our modelling shows that it's best to move off gas for most housing systems, so that there's, as I mentioned in the presentation, it's actually an economic cost of gas, of electrification here in Australia. It's not to say that gas isn't still economic for, say, peaking plant and for some industry, but for houses it's economic already to electrify. So to answer the question, we're already at that point.
And who is paying for the home electrification upgrade? The household, the gas company, or other gas consumers, the electricity company, or the government?
So in California, it's interesting that they're not as coordinated with their process, and so they're just leaving it for the gas company to pay for those upgrades. They are allowing some of the cost of those upgrades to go on the regulated asset base. So that's something that allows the gas company to justify the cost of that electrification and pay it off over a long period through the bills of the rest of the community. In Australia, we treat our asset utilities separately from our electrification costs, and that we haven't integrated the cost of the home upgrade inside the regulated asset base. That's not been the direction yet in Australia. Certainly in California, that's something they've been happy to put into legislation, and they see it as a good way of working with houses and to turn off gas pipes and electrify.
Fantastic. And is California switching people to bottled gas, or is it all electrification? In Victoria, most of the customers coming off the closing gas networks are going straight onto LPG, as I understand it.
So to answer that question is some LPG kind of makes sense because it's almost no capital required. You just deliver the gas bottle and keep your gas stove. But the operation of that gas system still is economic if you can access the finance. And so obviously some houses don't have the capital to make that transition. But as I mentioned, it's economically sensible if you can access the capital to actually make that transition across to changing your stove, changing your hot water system, and turning off any gas heating systems and running your reverse cycle air conditioning to create heat. So I mean that is not surprising that many of those houses are putting in bottled gas. because not everyone can access the capital to make those changes. But sensible policy would mean that you'd assist those houses to access that capital.
I've got an interesting question here from Lawrence. How politically sensitive is gas pricing in California, and what are the implications of that policy for policy and regulatory learnings? Lawrence says, I think the underlying pricing of gas commodity in North America is much less than here.
That's correct, yes. So the cost of gas is much lower in California, so that the economics aren't as compelling as they are in Australia. But the areas that they're turning off gas pipes is simply on the economic cost of the gas asset itself. So in many cases, the driver there is the cost of maintaining gas pipes. In our case, it's not the gas pipes that's the driver, it's the cost of the gas itself, and the supply of gas to homes makes it economic to make the shift. So there were two parts of the question. The other one, which is the political sensitivity or the political view, in California, they're not particularly worried about the cost of gas. Obviously, they're worried about the carbon content, but they're not so. It's not so centred around the cost of gas. This question of shifting, but they're recognising that it's just inefficient, really, to be continuing. Quite apart from the carbon effect, it's just inefficient economically to homes on gas, electricity.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Someone's asked, with California's process for 2/3 of people voluntarily agreeing to switch off gas, who's responsible for managing this process? Is it the networks or is it government?
So in California, they're using the gas utility to work with those customers. So it's the responsibility of the gas utility. So they're the ones, as I mentioned, have got the motivation because they're facing the high cost of maintaining those gas pipes. So it's the gas utility, which plays a very different role to the gas utility here in Australia, where we have gas retail and gas utilities separate. In California, they're one and the same entity. So government is not really involved. It's the gas utility. But they're doing that through regulation, as I mentioned, because they're allowing some of those costs of the electrification to go on to the regulated asset base. So the price of electricity is increased slightly in California because of that gas electrification of buildings to take the gas out.
And on the scale of statewide intervention to sub-council level community practices, do you think change would be best performed en masse, or is localized hotspots of change more compelling?
So one of the images I showed was the way that gas pipes flow through streets, and the economic transition is to actually do the one gas pipe at a time. And so that's groups of houses. It's not a statewide thing. In fact, if we did one or two houses on every street in Victoria or Australia, you'd end up with 100% of the cost of running the gas system loading onto the remaining customers. This is not sensible policy because it means that either those customers will be paying enormous prices for their gas, or you're subsidising those customers, and that doesn't make sense. Much better to be coordinated policy that you actually transition groups of houses and turn off gas pipes gradually.
Glen, and a question from Hugo. Does it make sense to wait for a gas pipeline to become uneconomic before it is decommissioned, or this might make sense at the start of the energy transition when a few remote regional pipelines are first to become uneconomic? Once the transition is underway and urban pipelines start to become uneconomic, they are all very similar and may become uneconomic all at once.
So you're kind of right. I mean, if we think of that map I showed where the AusNet gas pipelines had a I mentioned that some of the areas of their system were yellow, so that was a different colour because they're older pipes that are running at lower pressure. So they're right in the middle of Melbourne, so that it's in Sunshine area, West Sunshine, and that is that image on the left there. You can see that's a picture of Melbourne, and the blue area are the gas pipelines for at high pressure in the AusNet area, and the yellow pipelines are the low pressure ones that would be economic from a point of view of shifting the first pipes. So yes, absolutely, the transition would need to start there, and further down the track, you'd have a lot of these policy processes are complex, hugely complex. So developing the skills and the process, a bit like rolling out solar in Australia, there was a very high subsidy at first, and that drove the adoption of solar. Similarly, with this gas transition, there'll be learnings, it'll take time. I don't expect that we're going to turn off the whole gas system within a few years. It'll take a number of years to learn and work out how to be fair to those houses and those gas customers so that they transition without backlash and transition happily, and the benefits actually flow to those people.
Thanks, Glenn. And how has California considered the need to keep some sections of the distribution network for hard-to-electrify industry that will continue to need gas?
So the transition is by distribution. On the distribution side, all of this, we're really talking about distribution. Gas pipes, they're the smaller pipes. Most of the large industrial users are on the transmission system or closer to the transmission system, and therefore it's not the same pipes. So there's very little overlap in most cases. Obviously, there is the odd house sitting next to large industry that might be supplied by the same pipe. We wouldn't be talking about those ones. We're talking about those pipes that are running through the streets and supplying just houses and some small businesses. So to answer the question, they're not turning off any of the ones that are running into factories.
Yeah. In reference to going pipeline by pipeline, what's your opinion and how best to practically implement this, given that individual households may need to electrify before the end of life of their appliances and they may not have capital to do so?
I quite like, and I can't really make the recommendation here, but I'd like the idea of putting some of the cost onto the regulated asset base, because then we all benefit and that shares that cost. The difference between a householder going and buying a new air conditioner or a new stove, electric stove to turn off the gas stove, where they might have a very high cost of capital, so they might have to put on their credit card, for example, and pay extremely high prices. The regulated asset base effectively is a very low return on assets, so you don't pay that high interest rate. So that way you're actually leveraging that low cost of capital that's available.
Do you think it's likely we'd get 2/3 of households on a particular street to agree to electrify, particularly given gas is still affordable for most and the gas networks don't have an incentive to decommission? What sort of interest is California seeing from residents?
Well, California, as I mentioned, has gone through a process shutting down some parts of the gas system where they've got 100% agreement. And part of getting 100% agreement has been to pay for the cost. So the households haven't had a significant cost. Those costs of electrification have been borne by the utility, and as I mentioned, a lot of those costs end up on the regulated asset base. In Australia, we run those two separate systems separately, and it's going to be very difficult to coordinate, and that's why I talked about coordinating. Gas pipe policy mainly is regulated through the Australian Energy Regulator from a federal level, whereas the subsidies for electrification are all at the state level. So that coordination that I mentioned in my slide set is a key part of this process of actually solving this problem in Australia.
Yeah. And who does the assessment of whether it's economic in California? Is it the utility? Is there a conflict of interest here?
Well, in fact, arguably, there's not a conflict in as much as they're just running their business and they're allowed to consider that opportunity to electrify and in terms of their return on assets. So they still have to answer to shareholders, and so that they're just reviewing their cost of doing business and making decisions based on a set of rules which are not just part of the statute 1221 that I talked about, but other statutes that control their operation in California. So I don't think that of course there's a potential for conflict of interest, but I don't think they're operating with a conflict of interest. I think they're managing that in their rules. If you think about the decision and the assessment, a lot of it's sitting in that mapping tool that I showed. So that slide that I showed, that angle diagram, which showed all of the various parts of their mapping software, and that's where they make that economic costing. They make that costing using their mapping tool. Work out which pipes to turn off.
Yeah, thanks, Glenn. And just one more question to wrap it up for this Q&A session. Does Australia need to do something to sweeten the deal for networks to support electrification? Currently, if networks were to do that, their shareholders would need to wear the cost and write off the network, which I can't see being palatable.
And that cuts to the key problem we've got in our structure in Australia is the shutdown of gas assets in Australia is going against the intent of the legislation as it stands under the Australian gas law. There have been some proposals which have been put forward by the Energy Consumers Australia in terms of changing that rule, and that's being considered by the AEMC at the moment. So I think that process of changing the rules in Australia will hopefully incentivise those utilities, the gas utilities, to enable this transition. And Energy Consumers Australia is right in the middle of that process. So.
Yeah, it's a great segue. Thank you so much, Glenn, for answering all these questions, and thank you to everyone for giving us all these questions. Just before I hand it over to Adam, do you have any closing remarks, Glenn?
No, I guess the key here is that we can be pretty optimistic, even though some of these issues on the gas side are not solved. Of course, most, very, very high percentage of homes in Australia are already with solar, and we're starting to get the right subsidies for supporting people to get insulation and other transitions for their homes. And we have such low costs of installation. I talked about the solar and battery booms and what's driven that. I mean, in California, there was a battery installation that was sitting at 4 times the cost of a battery installation in Australia. So 4 times the cost means that effectively it's just not economic at all, and it's just the rich that get batteries in California. In Australia, we're in fact the homes that are getting batteries and have had solar as well tend to be in the outer suburbs. They're not the inner suburbs, so it's much more equitable, the transition.
Yeah, we're quite fortunate here, aren't we? All right, perfect. Thank you so much, Glenn. All right, and I'll hand over to Adam Collins now, who's the Executive Manager of Advocacy and Policy at ECA, and he's leading our work on the future of gas, and I'll just share.
Thanks, Claire. Thanks again, Glenn, for a really interesting presentation. Some very pertinent lessons there from California for us to be mindful of as we grapple with our own energy transition. As Claire mentioned, great segue from Glenn on the last question. So before we kind of wrap up, I just wanted to briefly mention some of the work that ECA is currently undertaking relating to the future of gas networks in Australia, in particular because there's an open consultation at the moment. I'm sure many of the audience are aware of that. So at ECA, we're keen to ensure that energy consumers are treated fairly as the energy system transitions. At the moment, we have some concerns that consumers are bearing an unfair burden of the costs associated with the declining gas network. So as part of our work on this, we submitted 4 rule change proposals to the Australian Energy Market Commission earlier this year. So these are all currently being considered by the AEMC. Consultation is open on all of the rule change requests at the moment through 2 kind of parallel processes. So the first of these rule changes is to require new connecting customers to the gas network to pay the upfront costs of connection. So at the moment, connection costs are socialised amongst existing gas users, and new customers generally do not face upfront connection costs. In the context of declining gas network and declining customer base, we don't think this is appropriate and therefore put forward this rule change proposal. The AEMC has actually gone through a round of consultation and has made a draft determination on this change, which largely aligns with our proposal. The AEMC is now consulting on the draft determination until the 30th of October, so we'd encourage people to take a look at the consultation documents on the AEMC's website linked on the slide. So the 3 remaining rule changes are also being considered by the AEMC as part of a broader consultation paper they put out recently that it's referring to as gas networks in transition. So these 3 rule changes are really about ensuring gas networks plan for the future, including planning for customers leaving the gas network and ensuring that consumers are not left to pay an unfair share of the cost as a result. So at the moment, there are fairly limited requirements for gas network businesses to provide public information and plan for the future of their networks. So one of our rule changes seeks to address this gap. It would require businesses to publish a gas annual planning report that will provide a multi-year forecast of the gas network, including progress on the transition process and forecast demand, as well as any augmentation and replacement projects and alternatives to investment. Another issue we are concerned about is network businesses proposing accelerated depreciation and regulators approving accelerated depreciation proposals. So this is essentially where network businesses seek to bring forward cost recovery of assets that are at risk of becoming stranded assets because customers are leaving the gas network. We think this places an unfair burden of the costs on consumers, essentially represents a transfer of costs and risk from network businesses to consumers. So what our rule change request proposes to do is to impose certain conditions or criteria that reduce the costs and risk to consumers before a network business is able to propose accelerated depreciation. The final rule change is around capital expenditure by networks, which is ultimately recovered from consumers. So from our perspective, in the context of declining demand, we think network businesses should be limiting new capital spending to what is strictly necessary. What we're seeing is still large capex proposals in addition to networks seeking accelerated depreciation. So this rule change would introduce new criteria to require greater rigour and scrutiny around capital expenditure proposals in the context of declining demand. So those 3 rule changes, as I said, are part of the AEMC's consultation paper on gas networks in transition, which also considers a range of broader transition issues beyond the rule changes I've just outlined. So that paper also closes for submissions on 30th of October. I encourage people to have a look at that and to engage in the consultation process. So let's go to the final slide. Thanks again very much to Glen for his presentation today and for his generosity as well in answering questions from the audience. Just a reminder again that applications for the next round of the scholarship are currently open until the 19th of October, end of next week. So that's it from us today. Thank you everyone for coming along today and for participating in the Q&A. If you have any questions for ECA, feel free to contact me or others at ECA. Glen also provided his contact details earlier if you want to learn any more about his research. So again, thanks very much for coming along, everyone, and we'll end it there. Thank you.